Okay, Chapter 10, Psychoanalytic Approaches, Contemporary Issues. So this is the part of lecture we're going to focus on D here in the outline. So let's fast forward to that. There we go. Each of his 8 stages for Erikson. Okay, so we got to the end here. And this is where we are now. So we're in capital D, early childhood attachment. So we've kind of left Erikson, but trust me, you're going to hear some of his theoretical foundational ideas. You're going to hear them still, even though the attachment theorists are much more current, contemporary in as far as historically go. You're still going to hear Erikson's kind of ideas. So let's talk about attachment and this thing called attachment. It's defined on your PowerPoint as the emotional bond between an infant and the primary caregiver. And it could be mom, it could be dad, it could be grandma, it could be nanny, it could be aunt, anyone who is the primary caregiver. That emotional bond is called attachment. Now, what researchers have come to find out through some really interesting studies looking at rhesus monkeys and various primates along the way, and even cats, is that the bond, this attachment, it's based on physical contact and warm responsiveness from the primary caregiver. So this bond, this attachment, is formed because of physical contact and warm responsiveness. So it's believed that we form this attachment early, from birth to about the first 6 months. Now, some people, other theorists, depends, because we're talking about attachment theorists in general. There's lots of different people who study attachments, lots of developmentalists looking at it. Yes, the first 6 months, definitely, but even some will stretch it to say the first year. But at least the first 6 months, and some, again, like I said, can stretch it to about the first year. But it's a really important time for forming this thing called attachment. Now, how we form this attachment is babies are born. And I said this earlier in the chapter, they don't want a lot of things at birth, but they want them all the time. They need them, they want them, there is no difference. And they have this host of needs, and what's happening during that time is the primary caregiver is either consistently meeting their needs or not so consistently meeting their needs. And it is a big deal for this little person. Remember, Erikson thought it was a big deal to develop this thing called trust. Freud thought it was a big deal. So this time, no matter who you read, and this is true, no matter what theorist you bring, go back 150 years, go to, current, everyone feels that the first 6 months to at least the first year is a foundational time to set the stage for the future. And here's why. We develop this important thing called attachment to our primary caregivers during this time based on whether our needs are consistently met from birth to about the first 6 months. And what's interesting is during that time, at least the first 6 months to the first year, we look at this formation of attachment, and then after that time, like the second 6 months or from the first year to the second year of life, you start seeing it play out already. You start seeing differences in the way that little one behaves based on how that first 6 months or how that first year went for them, and how successful they were at developing secure attachments or not. You see it very soon, but you will also see it long term. So let's talk. So this attachment, this emotional bond, is going to form in the early time of life from birth to about 6 months. And it's based on whether the needs of the infant are consistently met by the primary caregiver. Now, exploring this whole idea of attachment, you're going to read some stuff in your book. They started looking at different attachment styles in kids, different styles of infant attachment. So they explored attachment using this interesting research experiment called the Strange Situation Procedure. Mary Ainsworth was the researcher. She did this late 60s all the way up for over a decade and a half, she was still looking at this. Lots of people. You could spend your entire career looking at attachment and building off her work. You're going to read about it. Your text does a very nice job summarizing it. It's very clear. You're going to read about the strange situation procedure and the 3 types of infant attachment that she suggested came out of this strange situation procedure. Those are all on page 318. We're not going to cover it in lecture. Again, your book does it very clearly and concisely, but all that information is fair game for quizzes and tests. I went ahead and outlined here what you need to know. You need to know, first of all, what the strange situation procedure is, and you need to know about the 3 types of attachment that she talks about. Securely attached infants, avoidantly attached infants, which sometimes you'll see insecure avoidant, ambivalently attached infants. Again, sometimes you'll see them called insecure ambivalent. And by the way, if you're going to go on in this field, if you're going to go on in education or any type of social science, just know, by the way, the 4th one is added later. Your book doesn't talk about the 4th one, which is called disorganized attachment or disorganized attached infants. But just so you know, if you're going to go on in the field, you might want to write yourself a little note. 4D, you won't need to know it for this class, but it's just something good to put in your back pocket if you're going to go on in a field where you're going to revisit this. So you're going to read about that, and you're going to see what she did to realize that not all kids are the same. They certainly don't respond to the same situation in similar ways. And it has a lot to do with their attachment type. So researchers found that infants have different attachment styles. And what they did is they looked at the primary caregivers of those infants, and they saw different types of relationships between those primary caregivers and those infants. Those primary caregivers behaved differently. So what they proposed is that the relationship, this attachment relationship, whether it's secure or one of the other insecure attachments, has a significant impact on this little person. And here's why. So the theory says that based on our attachment that we develop, whether it's secure or insecure avoidant or insecure ambivalent, we develop, based on this attachment, something called a working model. And more specifically, I want you to know the full term. It's called an internal working model of attachment. And that full phrase isn't in your textbook, just working model, but this is really what I want you to know it as, because it's the full phrase of it. And I don't think you've been exposed to it before, and if you have, then you know by the long phrase. Internal working model of attachment. So, based on our attachments, we develop these things called internal working models of attachment. Now, an internal working model of attachment is defined on your PowerPoint. It's the mental representation. That's what we mean by internal, mental representation of 3 things. It's the mental representation of 3 things: the self, our attachment figure or figures, and relationships in general. So let's wrap our brain around what that definition means. An internal working model of attachment means a mental representation of 3 things, a mental belief about 3 things. And the 3 things are our self, our attachment figures, and relationships in general. We're going to learn something about ourself, attachment figures, and relationships in general. We're going to develop some beliefs about that, those 3 things. Now, this theory suggests that our internal working model of attachment is theorized to influence us in relationship building throughout our lives. So this idea of ourself, attachment figures, and relationships is going to influence us throughout our lives. And here's how. So I'm going to give you an example. Remember, we develop our attachments, whether it's secure or insecure, we develop them based on whether our needs are consistently met by our primary caregivers. So I'll give you an example. So here's an example of a baby born to a parent, a primary caregiver, who consistently meets their needs. Like really puts them first. Boy, at least for the first 6 months to the first year, this little one is going to have my attention, devotion, love, physical presence. I am going to meet the needs of this little one consistently. It's exhausting, but it's also wonderful. And in this example, say this primary caregiver does it. And that attachment is developed, and it's a secure, which is the best, by the way, type of attachment. They have this nice secure attachment. So they developed this thing called an internal working model of attachment. And what we said was that's the mental representation of the self. So what that baby develops, this mental representation of the self. And what happens with that secure attachment comes this belief that I matter. My real needs are important. I mean, yeah, sometimes I squabble about dropping my binky or whatever, but when I have a real need, it's important and it gets met. So I matter. I'm important. So that's the mental representation of the self. The mental representation of our attachment figure or figures for this little one in this example is this person, this other, my primary caregiver, I'm sure they're not conceptualizing them as that, but this person is good to me and is good for me and consistently is good to me and is good for me. The mental representation of relationships starts to develop as, and this thing we got going on, this primary caregiver and me, this thing we got, this relationship is good. It is good and it is good for me. It is safe and it is loving. And it is consistently safe and is consistently loving. And it is consistently good. Now, the theory says that internal working model of attachment that we just described for that securely attached infant will influence that little one in relationship building throughout that little one's life. So let's fast forward that little one from infancy to the first time that little one is going to have a relationship with someone who is not in their primary family. So they're going to have an intimate relationship outside of the family. They go into that relationship building experience with that same internal working model of attachment. So that infant that we just described who was securely attached to their primary caregiver, they're going to go into this new relationship in adolescence, because that tends to be when we start having these relationships. They go into this new relationship with someone, this intimate relationship with someone outside of the family, with this internal working model, this mental representation of their self. And what they believe about themselves is that I matter. My needs, my real needs, matter. They're important. And of attachment figures of this person that they're having this relationship with, they go into it believing that this person, they expect them to be good and good for them, good to them. And of this relationship in general that they're developing, they expect it to be good for them. It's good in general, safe and loving, consistently good, consistently safe, consistently loving. And that's what they expect, and then they tend to have those types of relationships. Because if they start having relationships with attachment figures that do not meet this expectation, then they cease those relationships. They don't become as intimate because they don't meet their needs. So they stop there and they look elsewhere. And that's like the best thing we want for our adolescents, isn't it? Go into a relationship knowing that you matter. Your real needs are important. And they should be important to this other person. Your real needs should be important to this person, and that other person should be good for you and good to you. And this relationship you have should be good and safe and loving consistently. And this theory says that that's what will happen with a securely attached infant grows into a securely attached young adult who starts expecting and then having these types of relationships that are healthy. Okay, but that isn't always the real world, is it? So sometimes a baby is born to a primary caregiver who really has a lot going on, and that's just real life. Now I'm going to pick a pretty common example, and I'm going to pick somebody with an addiction, because just by the very nature of an addiction, we're talking about a primary caregiver consistently meeting the needs of an infant. Just the very nature of an addiction takes a lot of time, and you got to be motivated to have that addiction keep going. You got a lot of work to do. No matter what you're addicted to, it takes time, and that's time away from other things. So I'm gonna choose an addiction. So say a child is born into this world and their primary caregiver has an addiction, which by its very nature takes them away from being able to consistently meet the needs of this little one. So when this little one is having a time where it needs soothed or changed or fed, and the primary caregiver is too busy with whatever addiction they have, it doesn't go well. They don't get their needs consistently met. And maybe the primary caregiver is frustrated and doesn't know why you keep crying, and I have things to do and I just don't, and could you just, and I'm going to put you in the room to just cry it out. You're just, I don't know. And they shut the door and they're gone, and or they shake, or they yell, or they hit, or they, because they got something else on their mind, other things. This little one is, I can't figure it out. It's tough. And it is. So that attachment, because the needs of the infant are not consistently met, they do not develop a secure attachment. They develop one of the insecure attachments. And I won't even specify between the two. I'll just say it's not a secure attachment. So this little one does not have a secure attachment to their primary caregiver, because their primary caregiver is just incapable of consistently meeting their needs during the first 6 months to the first year of their life. Now, we said they developed this working model, this internal working model of attachment, which is, again, the mental representation of the self. So what's it mean for this baby that we're talking about? It means that they believe that I matter and my needs matter sometimes, and sometimes my primary caregiver is too busy for me, or too mad, or too asleep, or too drunk, or too absent to meet my needs. But my needs matter sometimes. That's their mental representation of the self. Of our attachment figure or figures, they come to understand that this attachment figure is good to me and is good for me sometimes. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're frustrated with me, and they show it by yelling at me, or ignoring me, or leaving me, or shaking me. But sometimes they don't. And the mental representation of relationships in general, this little baby says, and this thing we got going on, this attachment figure in me, this primary caregiver in me, it is good, and it is good for me sometimes. And sometimes it's not necessarily good for me. It is safe and loving sometimes, but sometimes it isn't safe, and sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it's just non-existent, and it's not loving, and it scares me sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. So that's the internal working model of attachment this infant is developing. Now let's do what we did for the other example. Let's fast forward that infant to an adolescent who steps out of their family of origin to have an intimate relationship with their very next attachment figure, the first one that's not a family member. They walk into that relationship with this internal working model of attachment. They have the mental representation of themselves, that I matter and my needs matter sometimes. Not all the time. I mean, sometimes, yeah, but sometimes maybe the other, no. So I matter sometimes. And of this attachment figure, this person they're having the relationship with, they are good. They are good to me, and they are good for me. Sometimes. And sometimes they're not. And sometimes I frustrate them. And sometimes they're just simply not around, or not responsive, or not emotionally connected to me in a healthy way. But not all the time. And of this thing we got going on, this attachment figure in me, this relationship thing we got going on, it is good and it is magical and it is wonderful and it is loving and it is safe. Sometime it is. But sometimes it isn't loving. Well, it isn't loving at all. And sometimes it isn't even safe at all. And sometimes it hurts emotionally and sometimes physically. So you see that they go into those new types of relationships, because now they'll have relationships outside of the family starting around adolescence. They go into those relationships with a different working model of attachment, their representation of themselves, and do they matter, and how much do they matter, and of attachment figures, of people they have relationships with, what should they be like to them, and this relationship thing, what should it be like overall. They go into it with a different expectation, and research suggests they have different types of relationships that are less healthy. So you can see why this idea, this theory that the first 6 months, developing this thing called attachment during the first 6 months of life is so unbelievably important, because it sets the stage for that little one to develop relationships, healthy relationships, for the rest of their life. So whatever we can do as parents or caregivers, is to devote ourselves to our little ones as much as possible for the first 6 months to the first year, and to be as present as we possibly can, and be as loving and consistently meeting the needs of this little one as we possibly can, so that we set the stage so they expect a whole different kind of relationship from the rest of the world when they go out having relationships when they're older. So it's like really putting in our time early so that the payoff is very big, but it's much further down the road, but it's worth it. Now, by the way, lots of people say, well, what happens if we didn't have a secure attachment with our primary caregiver? Are we out of luck, SOL? And quite honestly, for decades, they did believe that to be the case. And luckily, for the last few decades, 2 decades at least, people have been looking at this idea of, okay, so say we did have insecure attachments to our primary caregivers. Can we go on to have successful relationships later in life? And the hands down answer is yes, of course we can. So then people got interested in how. If that theory is true, if it plays out, how are people who are having such insecure attachments having successful relationships later? And researchers have spent a lot of time on this, and I was very lucky. That was my dissertation spent time looking at a 10-year longitudinal data that followed them, kids from birth to 10 years old, and then followed them into young adulthood. So we had wonderful longitudinal data on about 300-400 people. And we started looking at attachment and later relationships. And one thing that we were very interested in as a research team was alternative caregivers. And we didn't come up with this idea, but there was a whole other field of research looking at alternative caregivers, and we were just adding to the field of research. And here's what's found is if we've not had a successful, secure attachment with our primary caregiver, other relationships in our lives can help us rebuild what we didn't get at that time. And it may take longer. It may take a while for us to realize that we really do matter. It may take a couple times, a couple relationships, years of someone telling us, maybe a really good therapist or a really good friend or a good relationship or family member, somebody helping us, or us having a lot of insight and realizing, reading something, thinking about something, that we really do matter. Our important needs are just that important. And alternative caregivers take the place of that primary caregiver, and they help us reimagine and rethink what to expect from someone we have an intimate relationship with, somebody we have a relationship with, and relationships in general. We start to understand what is more healthy, and we start to expect it, and we start to only accept it. And then, lo and behold, that is what we manifest in our lives. We have more healthy, successful relationships. So again, ideally, the infant gets it in the first 6 months to the first year. But if you are somebody who did not get that, all is not lost. Many of us are in that same situation, and research has shown how having other types of experiences and relationships along the way can help us rebuild that early attachment. And although it might be a little bit more work, ultimately we get a good payoff in the end. All right, and that is the end of the chapter.